Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This is Remembering the Year 1861, the year the Civil War began. James Buchanan is president on January 1st of that year. The country's population, 27 million. 18 million live in Union states and 5 million live in Confederate states. There are 4 million slaves. 80% of the population lives in rural farm areas. On January 3rd, Delaware votes not to secede from the Union. On January 9th, Mississippi becomes the second state to secede from the Union. The first state to secede was South Carolina back in December of 1980. On January 10th, Florida secedes from the Union. The next day, Alabama secedes from the Union. You see a pattern here. A lot of people think that it all happened at once, that all of these states just seceded from the Union at the same time. And what you're about to see is no, it took months and months for that to happen. So here we are in January. On the 19th of January, Georgia seceded from the Union. So each state legislature had to vote. On the 21st of January, Jefferson Davis resigns from the United States Senate. On the 26th, Louisiana secedes from the Union. On the 29th, Kansas is admitted as the 34th U.S. state, and it came in as a Union state. On February 1st, Texas secedes from the Union. On February 11th, in an attempt to stop more states from seceding, the U.S. House unanimously passes a resolution guaranteeing non-interference with slavery in any state. This was an attempt to stop any other states from seceding from the Union. On February 18th in Montgomery, Alabama, Jefferson Davis is inaugurated as the provisional, temporary president of the Confederate States of America. On February 23rd, President-elect Abraham Lincoln arrives secretly in Washington, D.C. in the middle of the night after an assassination attempt in Baltimore is foiled. Detectives, Pinkerton detectives, had detected a plan to assassinate the president in Baltimore as he changed trains on his way to Washington. So they took him off the train, put him in a dress and a bonnet, and transported him by carriage from Baltimore to Washington, D.C., and he arrived in the middle of the night. He was widely ridiculed for this in the press after that. On March 4th, Abraham Lincoln is sworn in as the 16th President of the United States. On March 4th, the American Stars and Bars is adopted as the flag of the Confederate States of America. Now, I know what you're thinking. Most people, probably 98%, think that this is the Confederate flag. It is not. This is the battle flag of the state of Mississippi. This is the official Stars and Bars, which was adopted by the Confederate States. This is the official Confederate flag. At least it's the first of 3 Confederate flags. So from 1861 to 1863, the Stars and Bars. In 1863 through 65, this was the flag. It was mostly white with this stars and bars in the upper left-hand corner. And then they added a red banner finally in the year 1865. So these are the three official flags of the Confederacy. On April 12th through the 14th, the Civil War begins at Fort Sumter, South Carolina, and Fort Sumter surrenders after 3 days to Confederate forces. So this is April. On the 17th, the state of Virginia secedes from the Union. So it's now taken 5 months for states to start seceding. On April 20th, Robert E. Lee resigns his commission in the United States Army in order to command the forces of the state of Virginia. Robert E. Lee was a very fine Union officer. He was the commandant of West Point at one time. But he decided to go with his heart and his state, and so he resigned his commission to join the Confederate forces in his home state of Virginia. On April 25th, the Union Army arrives in Washington, D.C. Basically, Washington was left undefended all this time. So the commanding officer of the Union Army sent troops into Washington, D.C., since Virginia had just seceded. And of course, Virginia surrounds Washington, D.C. On May 6th, Arkansas secedes from the Union. On May 8th, Richmond, Virginia is named the capital of the Confederate States of America. Richmond was a city of about 200,000 people at that time. On May 10th, Union military forces clash with civilians on the streets of St. Louis, Missouri, resulting in the death of at least 28 people and injuries to another 100 people. So the Confederate forces and the Union forces fought bitterly in the state of Missouri for control of that state. On May 13th, British Queen Victoria issues a proclamation of neutrality, which recognizes the breakaway states as having belligerent rights. Why did they do that? Well, one of the reasons was money. Britain bought a lot of cotton from the South, and Britain was selling guns and ammunition to the Confederate States. On May 20th, Kentucky proclaims its neutrality, which lasts until September 3rd, when Confederate forces enter the state and take over. On May 20th, North Carolina secedes from the Union. So now it's been 6 months since the first state seceded. 6 months. On June 8th, Tennessee secedes from the Union. On July 21st, we have the first major battle of the Civil War. This is the Battle of Bull Run, or it's also known as the Battle of Manassas, depending upon if you're a Confederate or a Union. And it happened in Manassas Junction, Virginia. And it ended in a Confederate victory. This gets personal for me. Here's a map of the area of Washington, D.C. And you see this little town right here, Burke? I lived in Burke for 8 years when I worked in Washington, D.C. 7 miles away from Burke is Manassas, and this is where the Battle of Bull Run. Bull Run was the name of a creek that ran through here. So it's 7 miles from Burke to Manassas, and I was about 5 miles outside the city limits of Washington, D.C. So Manassas is sitting right on the doorsteps of Washington, D.C. The people in the Union states thought the war was going to be over in one battle. So Confederate forces started marching north, and they got up here to Manassas, and the Union Army came out to meet them. Well, everybody in Washington, D.C. thought this was going to be a real quick battle, maybe 30 minutes. So they put on their Sunday clothes, they packed their picnic baskets, and hundreds of people from Washington, D.C. rode out in their carriages to watch the battle. They thought it would be over in 30 minutes. They knew that the Union forces would win, and that would be the end of the Civil War. So they thought. Of course, the Confederate sources won, and the Union Army retreated in chaos, and hundreds of these civilians were caught up in the mad escape back into Washington. It was a nightmare for them. On July 22nd, after Union forces led by Nathan Lyon captured the Missouri state capital of Jefferson City, the Missouri Constitutional Convention reconvenes and removes pro-secessionist Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson from office, replacing him with a pro-Union governor. So the Union Army comes in, takes over the capital, gets rid of the governor who is sympathetic to the Confederates, and puts their own pro-Union governor in place. The Crendon-Johnson resolution is passed in July by the Congress stating, now get this, stating that the war is being fought to preserve the Union and not to end slavery. So once again, this was an attempt by the U.S. Congress to try to prevent any more states from seceding and to try to get those states that did secede to come back into the Union by promising not to do anything about the slaves. On July 26, George B. McClellan assumes command of the Army of the Potomac, which was the biggest, most powerful army in the North, following the disastrous Union defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run. So the Union called it Bull Run, the Confederates called it the Battle of Manassas. On August 5th, in order to help pay for the war effort, the United States government issues the first income tax as part of the Revenue Act of 1861. So this is when income tax first began in America to help pay for the Civil War. On August 10th, the first major battle west of the Mississippi, the Battle of Wilson's Creek, is fought, and it was a Confederate victory. Wilson's Creek is by Springfield, Missouri, in the far southwest corner of Missouri. So, in the beginning, the Confederates were winning the major battles of the Civil War. On September 6, forces under Union General Ulysses S. Grant bloodlessly captures Paducah, Kentucky, and this gives the Union control of the mouth of the Tennessee River. Control of the Tennessee and the Ohio and the Mississippi were very, very important during the war. So this is the first time the country really hears about this guy called Ulysses S. Grant. On October 31st, citing failing health, Union General Winfield Scott resigns as commander of the United States Army. He was a very old, frail man at this time. On November 1st, President Abraham Lincoln appoints George B. McClellan as commander of the Union Army, replacing the aged General Winfield Scott. So now McClellan is in charge of all the Union forces. On November 6th, Jefferson Davis is elected President of the Confederate States of America. On November 8th, the Trent Affair. The USS San Jacinto, which is a Union ship, stops a United Kingdom mail ship. This is a British ship, and it was the ship called the Trent. And they arrest two Confederate envoys. These are British citizens, James Mason and John Slidell, sparking a diplomatic crisis between the UK and the United States. On November 28th, the Confederate Congress admits Missouri as the 12th Confederate state, even though the governor was pro-Union. So Missouri was bitterly divided. On the 20th, Kentucky is accepted into the Confederate States of America. So it's been 11 months since the first state seceded. What were the popular songs in 1861? Some of you will know these titles. Dixie. Dixieland. John Brown's Body. John Brown's body lies a-moldin' in the grave. This was a very popular song for the Union Army to march to. For those of you that don't know the story of John Brown, let me take a moment and explain this. This is, I think, one of the great ironies of the Civil War. John Brown was a radical abolitionist. He was fighting to free the slaves. He led a rebel army, small army, in Missouri and Kansas, and he killed a lot of people. What he wanted to do was cause a slave uprising, and the slaves would fight against their governments and free themselves. So what he did is he raided a federal Union armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now West Virginia, but at that time, Harper's Ferry was in Virginia. So in October of 1859, he and about 25 of his fellow rebels raid this Union army. And what they wanted to do was get the guns and give the guns to the blacks and cause an uprising of all the black slaves. Well, they managed to capture the armory, and they wanted to give the guns to the black slaves, but there weren't very many slaves that wanted to take those rifles. So here they are, they're stuck inside the armory. So the president authorizes troops to go to Harper's Ferry and capture them. And they did that. Union forces captured John Brown at Harper's Ferry. When the Union forces got there and the battle started, it only lasted 3 minutes, and John Brown and his 20-some-odd rebels surrendered. Now, here is the great irony. Who did the president send to capture John Brown? They sent Colonel Robert E. Lee, a colonel in the Union Army, and he was in charge of the soldiers that captured John Brown. Here was another popular song, Eatin' Goober Peas. I remember as a young boy in grade school singing this song. Peas, 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 eating goober peas. Goodness, how delicious, eating goober peas. Still remember it. That's all I remember. The Bonnie Blue Flag. This was a Confederate flag. Popular song. So what was introduced in 1861? The Gatling gun. What they did is they turned a crank and these barrels would spin around and shoot bullets. This is kind of the precursor to the modern machine gun. And when it was perfected, it could shoot about 400 bullets per minute, which was devastating. Can you imagine walking into a wall of Gatling guns across a bare field? So the Gatling gun. The Parrott rifle. Now this is a small one, but the big ones were put on Union ships. This was invented in 1861. Very powerful, very accurate cannon. 3D photography was invented. That's where we get red, green, and blue mixed together to make a colored photograph. The Reese telephone. I was amazed when I discovered this. Now, quite frankly, it didn't work very well. It could barely transmit voices. It could barely transmit musical notes. It was considered kind of a toy, and it didn't last. Alexander Graham Bell, years later, came out with a telephone that worked. But at least the man attempted. Aha, here's something we've all heard of, the cylinder lock. Have you ever bought a lock and on it said Yale? That's because of this guy, Linus Yale. In 1861, he invented the padlock. And I can't count the number of Yale locks I have bought over the years. Invented in 1861. The average annual salary for a man was $400 per year. Let me convert that into our dollars. $400 back then is equal to $15,613 today. That is still a pathetic salary. The average salary in America right now is somewhere around $70,000. The cost of a new home was about $800. Depends on if you're talking about a house in the country, which was about $600, or a house in the city, which was about $1,000. So I rounded it off and said, well, let's call it $800. That $800 house would cost you a mere $31,226 today. Not bad. A horse cost $150. Doesn't sound like much until you convert it into our dollars. That means that horse was $5,854.99. Horses were very expensive. That's why horse thieves were hung or hanged. Who was born in 1861? I could only come up with a couple of names that have any significance to you and I. Number one was this guy, William James Mayo. I'll give you a hint, he is a doctor. And yes, he was one of the founders of the famous Mayo Clinic. And this guy, James Nesmith. Now you're going to say, who? I've never heard of him. You may not know his name, but I guarantee you know what he invented, because this man invented basketball in 1891. Thanks for watching, and I hope you learned something new about our country's history.